In the winter of 1867, the town patriarchs of Willow Ridge, Massachusetts, were basically brought to their knees.
Yeah, completely dismantled.
Right. But they weren't defeated by, an invading army or a sudden economic crash or even like a sweeping piece of federal legislation.
No, not at all.
They were defeated by an abandoned, drafty barn, 3 working-class women, and a battered copy of a philosophy book.
It honestly sounds like a piece of historical fiction, doesn't it?
It really does. But the events we're looking at today, which are documented in the historical narrative text for Women by Women, provide this incredible blueprint for how actual systemic power shifts occur.
Yeah, we're looking at a town that was completely defined by its textile mills.
Yeah.
I mean, deeply entrenched traditional hierarchy.
Exactly. And we're watching those hierarchies get dismantled from the inside out,
Right.
which is our mission for this deep dive.
Right.
We want to unpack how a quiet, almost invisible revolution managed to completely bypass the grand halls of power that we usually associate with, historical change.
It's a huge shift in perspective.
It is. So to understand the magnitude of what these women pulled off, I think we need to first understand the cage they were operating in. So paint a picture of Willow Ridge in 1867 for us. What are the actual mechanics of life in this town?
Okay, so Willow Ridge was your classic New England mill town. Picture cobblestone streets, sweeping meadows, and just these massive brick textile mills right along the river.
Like the classic Industrial Revolution postcard.
Exactly. And those mills were the undisputed economic engine of the town. But what the source text really highlights is the absolute rigid division of society.
The gender division, right?
Yeah. Men owned the mills, men ran the markets, men held the town meetings. The public sphere where money actually changed hands and decisions were made was entirely a male domain.
Wow. And the women were effectively quarantined in the domestic sphere.
Quarantined is honestly a really good word for it. Their lives were confined to tending children, cooking, and sewing by the dim light of oil lamps.
Just totally isolated.
Right. And it wasn't just a cultural preference, it was a structural barrier. Women were fundamentally separated from the actual mechanisms of capital and political power.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the inciting incident. Because before any revolution starts, someone has to hit a breaking point with the current system.
Absolutely. There has to be a catalyst.
And in Willow Ridge, we get to know Eleanor Wakefield. Now, the text introduces her as a widow and a former mill worker.
Yeah, it specifically makes a point to mention her calloused hands from years of weaving fabric.
Right. She's seen some incredibly hard labor. And her husband dies unexpectedly, leaving her completely alone with 2 young daughters, Annie and Clara.
And, the expected, almost mandatory path for a woman in her position would be to immediately return to the mills.
Because what else are you going to do?
Exactly. When you are hovering on the edge of starvation, you go back to the factory floor.
Well, she refuses.
Yeah, she refuses.
Instead of going back to those brutal 14-hour shifts at the mill, she decides to scrape by taking in piece rate sewing from her neighbors.
Which is still incredibly hard work.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
She's working from her isolated home, doing this grueling manual labor, constantly hustling just to put food on the table for her kids. Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
Because looking at Eleanor's situation, it feels incredibly familiar to me. She is essentially an 1867 gig worker.
Oh, that's an interesting way to put it.
I mean, think about it. She has no safety net, no benefits. She's paid per piece of clothing she finishes, and she's bearing all the overhead costs of her own labor.
Yeah.
All while being completely isolated from other workers.
What's fascinating here is that the gig worker parallel works really well for the economic isolation. But I'd actually argue it severely undersells the legal reality she was facing.
Really? How so?
Well, a modern gig worker at least has fundamental civil rights. In 1867 Massachusetts, women were still living under the shadow of coverture laws.
Oh, right. Okay, explain coverture for the listener, because that's crucial here.
So coverture was a legal doctrine where a woman's legal rights were effectively subsumed by those of her husband or male relatives.
Basically, you legally cease to exist when you get married.
Precisely. You undergo a civil death. So Eleanor, as a working-class widow, was barely considered a legal entity in the eyes of commerce.
Wow.
She couldn't easily secure a bank loan. She had incredibly limited property rights. So her hustle wasn't just a tough economic grind. She was navigating an economy specifically designed to keep her dependent.
That makes her isolation so much more dangerous. She's sitting alone by her oil lamp, doing everything society demands of her, and she's still drowning.
Yeah, she's playing by the rules and still losing.
And in that lonely frustration, she asks a pretty terrifying question. Why do women accept a life of such dependency and silence?
And that question is the spark. But, solitary frustration is pretty common. Thousands of people feel that exact same despair every single day.
Sure, we all get frustrated with the system.
Right. The transformation from personal misery to a collective movement begins with a very localized, honestly incredibly mundane event.
The Tea Party.
Yes. Eleanor invites two friends over for tea on a howling winter evening.
Wait, if solitary frustration is so common, why did this specific Tea Party spark a revolution? I mean, was it just the right place at the right time?
It was really the specific synthesis of the people in that room. You have to look at who she invited.
Okay, tell me about them.
First, you have Abigail Merritt. The text describes her as a school teacher with a really sharp wit.
So she brings formal education to the table.
Exactly. She has instructional capability. And then you have Josephine Carter, who is deeply unusual for the time. She's the fiercely independent owner of the town's small bookshop.
Oh, wow. A female business owner.
Right. So she brings access to capital, literature, and, crucially, a working model of female autonomy.
I see. So it's not just three friends complaining about their lot in life. You have the grueling reality of working-class labor in Eleanor.
Yes.
You have the intellectual framework and teaching skills in Abigail. And you have the seed capital and physical resources in Josephine.
Precisely. They basically formed a complete ecosystem of change in one single sitting room.
That's incredible.
And that's when Eleanor pitches her idea. She wants a space for women to share knowledge, trade skills, and support each other.
No profit motives for the factory bosses.
Right, and no seeking permission from the town's men, just a space for their own strength.
Which sounds amazing. But having a great idea over tea is one thing. How do three marginalized working-class women in 1867 actually acquire the commercial real estate to pull this off? Like you said, they don't have bank backing.
They weaponize what little they have, they pool their meager, hidden savings, and secure an abandoned, really dilapidated barn on the very edge of town.
An abandoned barn.
Yeah. It's a space the men of Willow Ridge deemed worthless, which meant it was affordable and, more importantly, largely ignored.
The physical reality of this is just staggering to me. The narrative describes them patching the roof themselves, clearing out years of debris, and setting up an impromptu library.
With books donated directly from Josephine's shop inventory, yeah.
And they christen it the Hearthstone Society.
Which is such a cozy name for something so radical.
It really is. And word starts to spread through the whisper networks of the town. At first, it's just a few women sneaking away in the evenings.
Just testing waters.
Right. But soon, millworkers, seamstresses, widows, and young girls are trekking out to this candlelit barn.
And now we have to look at what they were actually doing inside that barn, because the curriculum they developed was brilliant in its subversion.
Tell me about the curriculum.
Well, Eleanor runs a sewing circle, but it is entirely focused on creating goods to sell independently at the market.
So they're keeping the profits.
Exactly. Then Abigail is teaching arithmetic, reading, and writing. And Josephine leads discussions on political theory. She's bringing in the writings of Mary Wollstonecraft and Elizabeth Cady Stanton.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting to me. Society conditions us to hear a phrase like sewing circle, and we instantly picture something quaint, right?
Oh, sure. A group of women gossiping over some harmless needlepoint.
Exactly. But when you look at the actual mechanics of the Hearthstone Society, that is a massive mischaracterization.
Yeah.
I look at this operation and I don't see a quaint sewing circle. I see a 19th century startup incubator.
Okay, let's test that analogy. How are you defining an incubator here?
Think about the resource allocation.
Yay.
In a modern startup incubator, you have founders bringing different skills, sharing overhead, and pooling risk to launch something new.
That is true.
And that's exactly what they did. Josephine's books are the seed capital. Abigail's teaching is the technical training. And the sewing isn't a hobby. It is the manufacturing arm of the operation.
Generating revenue to keep the whole thing running.
Yes, they are pooling their labor to break the town's economic monopoly.
That holds up perfectly, especially when you look at the technical training you mentioned. Take the arithmetic classes, for example.
Yeah, let's talk about the math.
On the surface, basic math seems harmless. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, in a 19th century mill town, arithmetic was literal financial self-defense.
How so? Is it because of the wage structures at the mills?
Exactly, the wage structures. Mill owners frequently utilized intentionally confusing ledgers, predatory company store systems, or they docked wages for just arbitrary infractions.
So if you can't do the math, you're at their mercy.
Exactly. If you are a young female mill worker who cannot do complex arithmetic, you have to accept whatever pittance the foreman hands you at the end of the week.
Wow.
So by teaching these women math, Abigail was teaching them how to audit their own paychecks and fight wage theft. It was an immediate threat to the mill's profit margins.
That dual threat approach is what just blows my mind.
Yeah.
They are simultaneously giving these women hard, practical, money-making skills to survive the present.
While studying high-level political theory to change the future.
Yes. Let's talk about that theory for a second. The text says Josephine had them reading Mary Wollstonecraft. Why her specifically?
Well, Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Woman is foundational because of its core economic argument.
What was her main thesis?
She argued that society treats women like overgrown children precisely because they are denied education and the ability to financially support themselves.
Ah, so the dependency is engineered.
Exactly. Wollstonecraft's thesis was that you cannot be a truly moral, free human being if your sheer survival depends on the whims of a man, whether that's a husband, a father, or a factory boss.
So they weren't just reading it as an academic exercise.
Not at all.
The barn was an active laboratory for Wollstonecraft's theories. Economic self-sufficiency is the prerequisite for freedom.
That's the core of it.
If a woman can earn her own wage and understand the mechanisms of her own oppression, she no longer has to return to the dangerous mills.
And she no longer has to accept an unwanted marriage just to avoid starvation.
They basically built an escape hatch out of the Willow Ridge economy.
And as we know from history, anytime a marginalized group builds an escape hatch, the people who benefit from their captivity will try to nail it shut.
The system inevitably fights back.
Always. The society's success meant that women were pulling back from their factory shifts and stepping out of their isolated domestic routines.
Which the men are definitely going to notice.
Oh, absolutely. This wasn't just a cultural annoyance to the men of Willow Ridge. It was a direct threat to their power and their pockets.
Right. If you cut into the cheap labor supply, the factory owners are going to raise hell. And the text details how the whispers reach the townsmen and the backlash begins.
The reaction is swift.
You have the mill owners complaining about abandoned shifts, and then you have Reverend Hargrove. He's this staunch traditionalist actively warning his congregation from the pulpit that the Hearthstone Society is leading women astray.
The psychology of the backlash is really fascinating here. Notice how the economic threat is immediately disguised as a moral panic.
Oh, that's such a good point.
Hargrove doesn't say, these women are costing us cheap labor. He frames it as a spiritual crisis, an affront to decency.
Because that's how you get the whole town on your side.
Exactly. And the social pressure becomes immense. The text even notes that some women in the town, terrified of their husband's wrath, stay away and actually begin gossiping about Eleanor and her friends.
Which just shows how deeply effective that fear was.
Yeah.
It divides the very people who would benefit most from the society.
It's a classic divide and conquer tactic.
And all of this tension inevitably boils over into a direct confrontation. The narrative describes a night where Reverend Hargrove and a group of the town's men literally stormed the barn right in the middle of a meeting.
It is the ultimate stress test for everything the women have built over the past year.
So Hargrove barges in and booms at them, declaring the society an affront to God's order.
Heavy words.
Very heavy. He tells them that women are meant to be keepers of the home, not meddling in education and the trades. But Eleanor steps up to the front to defend them, and the contrast in their arguments is striking.
She doesn't use theology to fight him.
No, she uses pure, undeniable logic. She asks him point blank, what harm is there in women learning to read, in earning an honest wage, in helping each other?
Her defense strips away the moral panic and exposes the reality. They are reading, doing math, and sewing, nothing inherently destructive.
But Hargrove doesn't engage with the logic at all. He ignores the math and the reading entirely and sheets back that the real harm is defiance. He says, a woman's place is to obey, not question.
And there it is.
I have to ask you about this dynamic. Why is it that taking care of yourself, learning basic literacy, and making your own money is immediately perceived by the ruling class as a dangerous act of defiance?
This raises an important question about power dynamics. It's because it reveals the illusion of their control.
What do you mean?
Well, this goes back to the core nature of rigid hierarchies. Hargrove and the mill owners don't actually care if the women read or sew in a vacuum. What they care about is that compliance is the currency that maintains their authority.
Ah, I see.
Think about it. Eleanor and her friends didn't ask for a permit to use the barn. They didn't ask for a curriculum to be approved by the town council.
They just did it.
Right. By acting completely autonomously, they proved they didn't need the men to function.
So the independence itself is the insult.
To a traditionalist hierarchy, autonomy in a subordinate group is practically indistinguishable from violent rebellion. Defiance isn't about the specific action you are taking. It's about the fact that you claim the authority to take it yourself.
That reframes the entire confrontation. It's not about the books, it's about the audacity.
Exactly.
And after Hargrove delivers that line about a woman's place being to obey, there is this tense hush over the barn, which sets up what is arguably the most powerful moment in the entire narrative.
Delivered by Abigail Merritt.
Yes. She steps forward from the back of the class into the lamplight, and she addresses Hargrove and the men directly.
It's an incredible moment.
She says, "We obeyed when you sent us to the mills as children. We obeyed when you told us to marry men we did not love, and we obeyed when you paid us pennies for our labor. No more."
Abigail's response is a masterclass in dismantling systemic hypocrisy. But we really need to ground that moment in the historical reality of 1867 to fully appreciate the risks she was taking.
Because it wasn't just a dramatic speech.
No, this wasn't a scripted movie scene where everyone gets to walk away safely after a good monologue. A woman defying town elders and her own husband like that faced immense legal and physical peril.
What could they actually do to her?
She could be deemed legally unfit and lose custody of her children. She could be totally ostracized, resulting in starvation, or even institutionalized under the guise of hysteria, which unfortunately was a very common tool for silencing defiant women back then.
So they were risking absolute ruin.
Exactly the point. The narrative describes the physical blocking of the scene so well. The women stand together, shoulder to shoulder, their faces lit by the flickering lamps.
They don't back down.
They don't scream. They don't resort to physical violence. They present a unified, unbreakable front. It was a calculated, massive gamble that the men would not resort to outright violence if the women simply held their ground collectively.
And the gamble pays off. Faced with that unyielding solidarity, the patriarchy of Willow Ridge quite literally backs out the door.
They blink first.
Yeah, the men retreat in silence.
Yeah.
And having survived that crucible, having proved that they could not be intimidated or shamed into submission, the Hearthstone Society flourishes.
The fallout from that night really changes the economic and social fabric of the region. The text details how members of the society go on to launch their own independent businesses.
Using the skills they learned in the barn.
Right. And armed with their new understanding of arithmetic and their collective bargaining power, they actually successfully demand fair wages from those very factory owners who tried to shut them down.
The town's economy is forced to adjust to them because they finally organized the labor supply. And they didn't keep this contained to their own town either. The narrative notes that women from the society began traveling to nearby towns, speaking at gatherings, and basically planting the seeds of this incubator model across the region.
Yeah, if we synthesize the legacy of Eleanor Wakefield, it's a profound testament to localized action. Her daughters, Annie and Clara, grow up as educated women who never know the sheer dependency their mother faced.
She broke the cycle.
She really did. Eleanor never sought national fame. She wasn't trying to lobby the federal government. But her actions prove that systemic revolution doesn't have to start from the top down. That drafty barn became the blueprint for an entire movement built on the philosophy of for women, by women.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? Why should you care about a localized labor dispute in 1867?
It's a fair question.
I think the takeaway here is incredibly empowering. When we absorb the story of Eleanor, Abigail, and Josephine, it proves that you don't need a massive public platform to spark real change.
No, you really don't.
You don't need vast wealth, and you absolutely do not need permission from the people who currently hold the power. Sometimes, all you need to change the world is shared knowledge and a quiet, dedicated space to ask the question, why?
It's a permanent reminder of how potent community and the pooling of resources can be when weaponized against entrenched systems.
They saw the exact tools used against them and repurposed them.
Right. They identified the mechanisms of their oppression, wage theft, lack of education, isolation, and they built an engine to counter every single one.
A brilliant summary. To recap our journey today, we started with a widow, physically exhausted and legally marginalized, working by an oil lamp.
Yep, the ultimate isolation.
We watched her take that lonely frustration and synthesize it with the education and capital of two friends over tea. We analyzed how they transformed an abandoned barn into an economic and intellectual incubator that threatened the entire power structure of their town.
And we witnessed them stand shoulder to shoulder, risking their livelihoods to defend their right to autonomy.
It's a narrative that forces us to reevaluate where we look for the beginnings of historical change.
It really does. True change often starts in the shadows.
It does indeed. And as we wrap up this deep dive into For Women by Women, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over. We've seen how a discarded, freezing agricultural building in 1867 could secretly incubate a revolution simply by bringing marginalized people together to share practical skills and radical ideas.
So look around our modern world.
Exactly. What are the abandoned barns of our era? What overlooked quiet spaces, whether they are unindexed digital forums, group chats, or obscure community centers, are secretly incubating the next massive societal shift right under our noses today?
It's something to think about.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the systems around you, keep learning, and we'll catch you next time.